Okay, so here we are on Earth. This is where it's happening. I mean, sure, there may be things happening elsewhere, but for us, this is where it's happening. And when you're looking at a chart, this is at the center of the chart. Because this is where we are. Doesn't matter what part of it you're on, right? It's one tiny little ball in a big system, and we're going to take a look at what that system really looks like, and then we're going to talk about what some of the things, mainly the planets, what they actually represent and why. So here we are over the North Pole, and let's just take down the background stars. I mean, it's neat to have the sense of that context, but when it really comes down to it, it's our local system that we're concerned with. Now, I can't take all of the stars all the way down. There are a few still sitting there because if I actually remove all of the stars, it turns off the sun. And so we're going to want to be able to see the sun. So let's take a look at what this system that we're living in looks like. Now, of course, this is our best understanding. It's maybe not 100% accurate, and I have no way of really verifying the extent to which the scales in this program are correct, but I think it's roughly what's really going on here. So now we are moving away from the Earth, and you can start to get a feeling for just how much space there is in this solar system. And of course, this isn't even beginning to give us a sense of the space between stars. And of course, that wouldn't give us even the slightest hint of what kind of space there is between galaxies. But we know for certain that, to our best understanding, we're getting quite a bit away from where we are, and we still, oh, there it is, the nearest object, our own moon, right? So now I'll speed it up a little bit, and I'll turn on the orbit so we can start to see where we are. And you'll notice that that red line going through where Earth is, that kind of gives you a sense of just how far we have yet to go. So at some point or another, we'll start to see our nearest planets. I'm going to speed it up a little more. So we're going about 2.31 light speed per hour is, I believe, what that means. So we're traveling at pretty fast speed. And we have yet to see our nearest planetary neighbors. It's hard to believe. I have a hard time believing it still. But there we go. I'll slow it down a little bit. So closer to the sun is Venus. Here comes Mercury. And on the way out is Mars. We still don't see it. We only see what its orbit is. And then at some point we should see the sun in the center. This line is, I'm not entirely sure, but there are a couple of objects. You can't just turn on and off whatever objects you want in this program. So there's a few objects in the outer part of the solar system that have some very odd orbits. So that's probably what that is. But now we're starting to see, what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring the sun to the center. Okay. That kind of gives us a better sense of the arrangement of the system. So this is Earth. This is where we are, right? And as it stands, we still haven't gotten to any of the larger planets, the gas giants. Here's Ceres, which is the largest asteroid in the asteroid belt. And it's said that there's a mathematical relationship between the orbits that suggests that at one time there was a planet here that experienced something of an unknown character that caused it to break up into many, many pieces. That's what we call the asteroid belt. And the asteroid belt is kind of the dividing line between the inner, or sort of rock-like planets, and the outer, gas giants. I'm speeding it up a little bit more. So the next one we'll see is Jupiter. Here it comes. And at this scale, Jupiter, like all the other planets, is just going to show up as a little dot along its orbital path, which is right up here. So obviously this is a diagram of the solar system with really limited utility when it comes to getting a sense of what's going on here. But in the broad picture, it does give us a pretty good sense of what we're living in, what this solar system is. Now, some people will say, well, with this kind of space, how on Earth, how on Earth could any of these objects, even a large one like Jupiter, really affect what's going on planet Earth? But the interesting thing to consider is that the spaces involved here, on a relative level, aren't really all that unlike the spaces within atomic structures. It's been noted that the nuclei of atoms are incredibly small compared to the space around them. And so we know that it takes only a small amount of certain substances to really radically change the configuration of molecules. So why wouldn't the configuration of a solar system make a radical difference in what's happening within the overall system? I don't see what problem there is there, but some people have a hard time imagining why. I mean, it's easy to understand why the sun has an influence on everything, right? Because if that thing went out, none of this would be arranged the way it is, for one, and we wouldn't have the energy necessary on Earth. So what we're going to discuss is a kind of poetic way of looking at this system. So here's a number of objects that are not usually used in a natal chart, but here's Pluto, right? But like I said, this is of limited use to us, but it does give us kind of a context, a way of orienting ourselves. But let's go to something else here for a moment. This is a similar picture, but it gives us the labels, a little more compact. It shows us the orbital periods, the amount of time that it takes for each of the objects to make a single trip around the sun. And so one of the first things that we can learn about our system is that once you get to Jupiter, it takes about, a little less than 12 years for that thing to make a trip around. And that means that everyone born within, let's say, about a year is going to have a Jupiter in the same sign. It'll be a different position, but it'll be Jupiter in the same sign. And of course, it'll be even longer that Saturn remains in a single sign, right? And Pluto, with 248 years, that's over 20 years in each sign. So here we're talking about generational things, right? It gets much more specific to the individual the further you work your way in. So it's worth thinking, about the fact that each of us have planets, I'd say from like Jupiter on out, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, that are shared with our peers who happen to be born around the same time, and sometimes for many years. This is also worth noting. This is an image that gives us a sense of the relative size of the various objects. Obviously, the positions are all wrong. And, they left out Pluto because there's a big argument about whether or not Pluto's actually a planet anymore. So, whatever about that, it's definitely an object out there, so it really doesn't matter what we want to call it. What this is telling us is that, well, Earth is amongst the smallest of the objects in the solar system. The Sun is far larger than anything else. You can kind of extrapolate from this curve how much bigger it is than even the largest object next to it, which is Jupiter. So that's an interesting thing to recognize. This is probably the most useful diagram for our purposes. And I've added the symbols that are used within a chart so that you can see an association. Here's the moon, very tiny. And so what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the solar system from the point of view of Earth, because that's where we are. And we're going to talk about how things relate to Earth. Now, the easiest thing, of course, is the sun. And the sun represents the source of our energy. It's the central organizing principle of our lives, because it's the central organizing principle of the whole system. And it is the source of energy for the whole system. So that's what it is within us. Pretty simple. Now, the moon is the closest object to us. We feel it. It moves the waters, right? And that's essentially what it does inside of us, too. It's the way we feel. It's the movement of our sense experience. It's the kind of center of our emotional existence, really. The movement of the waters on the planet Earth is the movement of the emotion within the self. Now, Venus is our nearest neighbor in relation to the sun, and Mars is our nearest neighbor in relation to everything away from the sun. Now, all things on Earth, all living things, are concerned with the source of their energy. We are constantly thinking about how do we maintain our life. So our primary relationship, you could say, is with the source of our life. And that's basically, Venus is about relationship. It's the mediator between Earth and Sun. Now, of course, people will say, well, Venus isn't always in this position. It's not always between Earth and the Sun. It's sometimes on the other side of the Sun. But you have to remember that these things are orbiting. Cyclical patterns happening over and over and over and over and over again. The orbits are not just empty space. They have an energetic relationship with each other. Because if you were to think of the system as something which operated at much faster speeds, which is all kind of a relative thing to consider, because if you have an oscillator, you can slow down the oscillator and you won't hear it as being a tone. It'll just be an inaudible movement. But it's still basically a tone. It's just one that we can't hear. So each of these things has kind of a resonant property to it. And that resonant property is happening even though from our experience of time, it takes a whole year for us to get around the sun. What kind of a pattern would that be? But when you look at the annals of time, when you consider that this system is something that's been in existence for millennia, deeper than that, well, then you can start to get the sense of the resonance of the various objects involved. And that's why they have an influence. We're just experiencing it on a different time scale, so we don't necessarily feel that, although some do. Some are very well attuned to that. I think that in the ancient world, people were far more attuned to the natural cycles happening. And that's why this was such a resonant system for people. When they recognized that there were these objects moving around out there, they knew that there was some kind of a relationship with them, even before they understood that they were planets and that they were organized by the sun. Because, of course, people thought originally that the Earth was the center of this whole thing. So they were wrong about that, but they were right that these objects have an effect. So I'd mentioned now, because it's this mediator between Earth and the sun, Venus is about relationship. It's the way that we relate to things. It's not just love. It's not just romantic. It's actually more like, how do we functionally relate? Mercury is, as I mentioned before, it's a representation of the mind, because it's the thing which is circling around the sun most. It's the closest thing to the sun. And so our mind is always occupied with the source of our energy. How are we going to continue this life? How are we doing? It's an obsession. The mind is continually trying to get a sense of, am I doing well? Am I doing poorly? What do I need to do in order to maintain connection to this energy that keeps me alive? That's Mercury. Now Mars is heading away from the sun. It's taking an action. Like if we didn't have to do anything, we would never turn our gaze from the sun, in a certain sense, in the sense that we would never have to worry about trying to find some oblique path towards the source of our energy. We would just be able to bask in the glow of that energy and kind of like be a baby, sucking at its mother's teat and getting what it needs, right? But Earthlings have to struggle. And so action is necessary. And action means that we have to move away from the thing we want in order to get back to it. So the reason why Mars is associated with the warrior, there's a number of possible reasons. There's some interesting possibilities there. But one of them is that the warrior needs to leave home and go forth in the hopes that maybe someday they'll be able to make it back. And so it's that first venturing forth away from all of the things we would want, right? We want our connection to Earth. We want to feel good. We want to have relationships with others. We want the concerns of the mind to be allayed, right? But we have to take action and get away from all this stuff to get back to it. We have to go out there and explore in order to be able to return home. Let's ignore the asteroid belt for a moment. It does play an interesting role. But for now, let's just talk about the gas giants here. And I'm going to try and make this relatively quick because this is getting long. So Jupiter is the second largest mass in the solar system. If we look at the relative sizes, you can't see the whole sun here, but you certainly get an idea. The sun is way bigger than Jupiter, but Jupiter is definitely the secondary mass. And what it represents here inside of ourselves is experience. Because we have a kind of nature, and that's the basic foundation of who we are. But then we have the life experience, the things that happen to us. It's the whole nature-nurture battle, you could say. So it's that dialogue between our predispositions, the things we're kind of endowed with at birth, and the things that happen to us that lead us to think that life is of a certain nature. So Jupiter is that secondary mass. It's kind of the thing which has the most influence over the overall wobbling of the solar system. And likewise, experience in our lives is something which has that kind of secondary influence over what happens to us. Just beyond Jupiter, Saturn is, well, just beyond experience. Saturn is traditionally considered to be the challenge. And what is the challenge? Well, the challenge is always to get beyond our experience. So quite often they will talk about what's called the Saturn Return, which typically happens in your late 20s. you have a bunch of experiences in your 20s, leading up to your 20s, that lead you to think that things are a certain way. And quite often, you realize at a certain point that you've got the wrong idea of what's going on. And that's Saturn coming back to remind you that, hey, you know, whatever it is you experience, it's still just a very limited slice of the possibilities of what can be experienced. There is always more to experience. And getting beyond your own experience is, to a large extent, the process of learning. So that's why Saturn is traditionally considered to be a challenge. It's actually the opening of experience, which implies difficulty. So all of those associations are intact in this way of looking at it. And then, having opened experience, one comes to a better understanding of what it is that we're here to do. Because certainly, just serving ourselves, just being connected to Source, just having relationships and struggling and trying to feel good and all that kind of stuff, that's somewhat limited. There are more important things to do, one might say. There's something beyond our own individual concerns that calls to us and that we want to fulfill. And Uranus is the location of our calling, you might say, the thing that we're here to accomplish in this life. Neptune is the path away from the self. Neptune is the path away from the drama that's implied by the entire chart. And Pluto is the realization of that liberation. I call my readings Liberation Natal Chart readings because originally I was thinking of focusing on Pluto. But Pluto is, look how tiny it is, and it's way out there. I mean, you know, way out there. Right? Very elliptical, too. So it's very difficult to get a real bead on Pluto. So it's good to know about what it's about. It's good to know that it's possible, if unlikely, to relieve ourselves of the drama of the ego. But in many respects, I think for most of us, if not all of us, who knows, maybe some have achieved this. There are legends of the sages who were ascendant masters, right? It's part of the spiritual tradition. But I think most of us who are interested in getting beyond the kind of karmic inheritance that we struggle with, which is in many respects what the whole chart is about, it's this path that Neptune represents. So Neptune, it's associated with the watery depths. So the metaphor is at sea, dealing with forces unknown, at the mercy of forces far beyond your control or even ability to comprehend. And that certainly characterizes the spiritual voyage. So then, returning here briefly to the asteroid belt, we see the demarcation line between these inner hard planets and the outer soft, the gas giants. And these inner planets are kind of more pragmatic, materialistic, individual, ego-oriented aspects of personality. Whereas the gas giants are more expansive aspects of personality that transcend the individual and that ultimately, ideally, lead to liberation. So that's a tour of our solar system as a symbolic tie to our individual personalities. The configuration that we have inside of ourselves is reflected in the mechanism of the solar system, which, you know, if this is accurate, and there's only one way to find out, so if you have doubts about it, I would encourage you to get a reading. I would encourage you to get a reading from me, because other people are not going to use this type of system. But, you know, I'm biased towards the system that I work with. And there are certainly plenty of other people who do an amazing job. They can do some things that I can't do. But I do think this is a very consistent way of interpreting, and the only way to find out whether or not it makes sense is to actually have your own chart done. So I think one of the things I'm going to do is to start to put up some charts and read them for you. And again, I put out this offer. If anyone is willing to have their reading posted online, you don't have to be identified. It can be completely anonymous, and I will give you a discount on my already rather fair fee for doing this. I hope you found this interesting. I'll say the same thing I say all the time, which is if you'd like to support what I'm doing, there's a variety of things that you can do. I appreciate all comments and criticisms and interactions of all kinds, and I will try to continue. There's an awful lot more that can be said about this system because we still have the aspect relations. Let's see if I have that up here. No, I don't. So we still have a whole other segment to go in discussing how these things work. But even with just the 2 videos I've done, there's an awful lot that could be said about one's inner life with an alarming degree of accuracy. Alarming is perhaps not the right word. Amazing, I think, is really the word. And it's truly amazing not only to experience the degree to which this corresponds with one's experience of life, but also to consider that what this implies is that the solar system has a personality. And so what does that tell us about the creation that we're living in? This universe has mysteries beyond our ordinary contemplations. Because if we are a reflection in ourselves, in our experience of being, of the configuration of the solar system, well, what about the configurations in galaxies? How far out does this extend? Apply the principles. See if it works. Okay. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening and considering. And until next time, adios.